Complain about a broken tap or faulty radiator in your rented home and you could be thrown out onto the streets. That's the claim from housing charities who believe tenants deserve greater protection from their landlords. Landlords claim the reverse is true and that they are at the mercy of tenants. So how should government settle this very domestic argument? Here's Robin Markwell.
Britain's rented sector is booming. It's doubled in size in just 10 years. But lurking behind the walls, some home truths. 1 in 3 properties fail to meet the government's minimum standards for decent homes. Take this place in East Bristol. 5 people live in this squalor. They pay £157 a week for the privilege.
There's an extreme damp and mould coming through the roof here, which has collapsed due to a shower a few floors above.
We couldn't contact the landlord. The residents were afraid of speaking out, but a campaign group has taken up their cause.
It's disgraceful, it's shocking, there's absolutely no way that people should be living like this. I think it's criminal that people can make people live in these circumstances, charge money for it, which is adding insult to injury, and that nothing's been done about it.
This is the security I've got on my front door.
Just a few streets away, and another unhappy tenant.
A press lock that my sister fitted for me. Well, up there you've got a lovely damp spot that looks like a scary face. I don't think the guttering's been cleared for years.
She believes many people now live in fear.
A lot of people are afraid to say what's wrong because there's nowhere else to go for a lot of people. Yeah, and I just don't think it should be like that. I think housing should be a right.
They call them revenge evictions, where a complaint to the landlord is swiftly followed by a move to evict. The housing charity Shelter believes it affects more than 200,000 people in a year. It's done through so-called Section 21 notices, but the government wants to make it harder for landlords to issue them. A Bristol MP is hoping to push through the legislation before the election.
What we're going to do is to put in place a provision saying if a tenant has complained about safety in the home and the local authority has inspected the flat and has issued an improvement notice saying this must be repaired, this boiler really ought to have been serviced, then the landlord cannot evict at that point. And more to the point, they actually have to do the work as well.
But that's not gone down well with the landlords.
What?
Paul Routledge owns over 120 flats in Weston-super-Mare. He now runs a database allowing landlords to share information about tenants. He thinks, if anything, it's the tenant that has the whip hand.
If a tenant doesn't pay his rent, we have to go and get an eviction. And it can take up to 6 months minimum, up to a year. Yeah? But we have to keep providing them with the services. I don't see how tenants could possibly think that we had the upper hand when we're in that position.
It's clear the Dickensian conditions of yesteryear do still exist in some corners. The question for politicians is whether yet extra regulation will make any difference.
Well, I'm joined in the studio by the landlord Paul Routledge, who just appeared in our film there. Thanks for coming in. You saw some of the properties we filmed in. They're appalling. Are you surprised that we still offer accommodation like that in this day and age?
Yes, I am, but that accommodation is not widespread.
Well, we didn't have too much trouble finding it.
No, you wouldn't have trouble finding it, but it's not widespread across the rental sector. There are landlords who do act like that, and they're rogue landlords. And in 2004, we introduced the Housing Act and housing standards to stop landlords like that.
So how are they getting away with it then?
Local authorities are not dealing with it. Every piece of legislation that you require at this precise moment in time is in place to deal with landlords like that.
And yet you say it's the landlords who need protection.
Well, I don't say necessarily landlords or tenants need protection. What we need protection from is we need protection from tenants who continuously move around and use short-hold tenancy agreements as a way to stay in a property and not pay rent and or damage a property. I mean, with my properties, I spend an absolute fortune developing them. But on the other side of it, I have tenants that simply trash them. And when they trash them, there's no criminal proceedings or anything like that. No, I can't get the money for it.
Right, let's bring in the politicians. Paul, I mean, where do your sympathies lie?
Well, obviously, if a tenant has trashed a property, that's terrible. But my sympathies generally lie with the tenant, I have to say, certainly in my area, in the Cotswolds. You know, I've had horror stories from elderly tenants who feel very, very insecure. They're moved on at a whim. If they've complained about a boiler breaking down in the winter, for instance, I had one example, that the landlord decided to evict that.
A revenge eviction.
It was a revenge eviction.
You don't think those happen?
There's no such thing as a revenge eviction.
Well,
Section
that
21.
That has to be the case.
Okay, first and foremost, let's get it right here, because what you said there is they throw them out on the street.
Yeah.
But Section 21 cannot be issued within a fixed term of 6 months. They can only be issued when it goes into statutory. What are you nodding your head for? That's fact. That's the law. They cannot be evicted for the first 6 months unless you issue a Section 8. And Section 8s, are very difficult to get through and have specific criteria to issue in a Section 8. So for the first 6 months, a tenant cannot be evicted. So they can owe up to 6 months' money and not be evicted unless you go into a Section 8. Yeah?
But you can
then when it
afterwards.
runs into statutory periodic, you can then instigate proceedings. I've got 4 of those at the moment where the tenant hasn't paid a penny, they've trashed the property, and 9 months down the road, I'm still trying to get rid of them.
That's criminal damage, but what I've seen...
It's not criminal damage.
Many,
On the contrary, it's not criminal damage.
If you say that they've trashed the property, that's criminal damage.
It's not.
I've seen tenants who have asked for broken windows or roofs to be mended, who've asked for boilers that have broken down to be mended, and rather than that getting dealt with, they have been evicted.
So why don't they go to their housing standards officer and enforce
a lot of them are vulnerable.
the Housing Act
A lot
of
of them are
2004?
vulnerable people who don't realise they have rights.
Oh,
why should they have to?
What do you mean, why should they have to?
If
Exactly
they're
the same way as we
paying
deal with...
rent, if they're paying rent to a
Because there are
landlord,
rogues in our society and there are rules and regulations and laws in place to protect them right now.
Why should a landlord need to be named?
What about the elderly lady in
The problem we have here is, and I don't mean to be rude, but the problem we have here is that you don't know what you're talking about. And what you're talking about is you think we can throw them out on the street. First and foremost is every piece of legislation is in place to protect the tenant, not the landlord. Yeah.
Ed Miliband wants to bring in tougher regulation,
Yes.
doesn't he, and more protection.
And on letting agencies as well.
Would that, though, reduce the amount of rented accommodation that became available because landlords wouldn't bother?
I think one of the things we have to do is actually get more housing into the sector, because we have a
That I'll
chronic
agree with
housing
you.
shortage.
That I'll agree with you.
Excellent. We have a chronic housing shortage, and we wouldn't be having some of these debates and discussions if tenants weren't vulnerable because they felt they had no choice. Too many people in Bristol, as you saw, I've seen houses in that condition in Bristol. I've seen houses exactly like that in Bristol West. I think it's an absolute disgrace that a landlord should say, I need to be taken and forced to replace ceilings and roofs and walls.
Ed Miliband's proposals address that?
Well, we brought in the 2004 Housing Act that Mr Outledge referred to. We brought that in. We've also brought in housing legislation.
How's he going to do it?
In terms of the rural areas, there's a real lack of 1- and 2-bedroom housing for young and old. So I'm talking about those people.
So you're talking about vulnerable people and a lack of housing.
Yes.
That's got absolutely nothing to do
so
with
we're meant to do
landlords.
it- we
That's
can-
got
we can
nothing
do
to do with
both at the same
landlords
time.
doing revenge evictions.
You don't accept that landlords need any more regulation?
They don't need any more regulations. You've got the 2004 Housing Act for a start. You've got deposit protection. Yeah. You've got gas boiler safety. I can reel off about 10, 12 pieces.
Comply, but they don't comply, do they?
But then that's why you have legislation. That's why you have courts. What you're trying to do is you're trying to Let's get this right. What you're trying to do is you're trying to first and foremost is I believe no. What you're trying to do is you found a couple of kids that have piddled behind the bike shed, and what you're now trying to do. What you're trying to do is you're trying to blanket the entire PRS and say we're all that was I didn't. Did anyone say that? Shelter did a survey on this.
Can I just say one thing?
No, we have to call a halt here. But I mean, that was more than just a little bit of tenant damage, wasn't it? That was...
I've had tenants do that damage to my property and then go down to housing standards and tell them that I've left it like that.
Paul, thanks very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.
Well, it's been a busy and sometimes angry week in the world of West Country politics. Here's our 60-second rundown.